I mean, it's also just worth noting, in terms of what the inspectors could do, that he was able to report that they were dealing with the Al-Samud missile, which actually, if you go back to the intelligence, was the area where a step change in Iraqi capabilities had correctly been reported by British intelligence and put in the dossier. Was the firmest bit of the threat, and that was actually dealt with by the inspectors in March. So it wasn't that this was necessarily a wholly passive role that they were playing.
No, that's true, and obviously, as the prospect of military action and the troop build-up was there, he started to give more cooperation. But I would just draw your attention to something that I think, as I say, is of fundamental importance, and that is that Resolution 1441, it decided in paragraph 5, operational paragraph 5, not just that he had to give unrestricted access to all sites and so on, but it specifically focused on the issue to do with interviews. And
But this was always a very controversial issue. I mean, Dr. Blix was always very reluctant to, precisely because of the risks he knew they would be in, to take them out. I mean, he was never himself that enthusiastic about that.
Exactly, Sir Lawrence, but let me tell you, this is a really important point here. He wasn't enthusiastic. I used to have these conversations rather, with Hans Blix, where Hans would say to me, well, I agree we should interview these people, but you don't understand. They may be killed, or their relatives may be killed. And I would say to him, well, what does this tell us about the nature of the person we're dealing with and the nature of his compliance? I mean, yes, he was. He kept saying to me, I feel deeply personally responsible if I ask for these interviews to be conducted outside of Iraq, because I believe these people may be killed. But that, to me, was not a...
It was an illustration of the problems of dealing with Saddam Hussein.
Correct.
On the 14th of February, when Dr. Blix gave a presentation, gave a report, which was not long after Colin Powell's very significant speech of the 5th of February, were you disappointed by the line he was taking there, which seemed to row back somewhat from the position he'd taken on 27th of January?
It wasn't that I was disappointed. I was getting confused as to what he was really trying to tell us. Because what he kept doing is saying, well, yes, there is a bit of cooperation here, but then there's not cooperation there. And what particularly struck me about the 14th of February Blix report, and this then had a huge significance in what I tried then to construct as a final way of avoiding the war, is on page 26 of his briefing, he deals with this issue of interviews. And he says that the Iraqi side of, because they're starting to move on interviews, because he's beginning to press on it, they have made a commitment that they'll allow it. But then when he actually comes to the interviews themselves, people are very reluctant to do it.
But that's an inherent problem with this regime for the reasons that you've given.
Correct.
And we knew that beforehand.
Yes, but it's precisely the reason, therefore, why even if Blix had continued, the fact is he would never have got the truth out of Saddam and the leading people in the regime. The people who did get the truth out of him were the Iraq Survey Group. And what they found was that Saddam retained the intent. I know, but it's incredibly...
Well, but I think we've got the idea that the intent was there.
And the know-how.
And the know-how, and this isn't an issue of disagreement.
Right.
I'm sorry, Mr. Blair, did you want to make more of that? In fairness to you, I think we've taken the point. It's not in contention.
Well, it's just sometimes, I think, and I'll do this very briefly, but sometimes what's important is not to ask the March 2003 question, but to ask the 2010 question. Supposing we had backed off this military action, supposing we'd left Saddam and his sons, who were going to follow him, in charge of Iraq, people who used chemical weapons, caused the death of over 1 million people, what we now know is that he retained absolutely the intent and the intellectual know-how to restart a nuclear and a chemical weapons program when the inspectors were out and the sanctions changed, which they were going to be. Now, I think it is at least arguable that he was a threat and that had we taken that decision to leave him there with the intent, with an oil price not of $25 but of $100 a barrel, he would have had the intent, he would have had the financial means, and we would have lost our nerve.
Thank you. All right.
You had a phone call with Dr. Blix on the 20th of February, and he's written about this. I think he's written about it again this morning. We've obviously seen the record. Now, one of the things that people were commenting on by this time was that the smoking gun, as it's been called, that had been searched for, had not been found. A number of sites had been suggested, and nothing had been turned up. And I'm quoting what he said. He said, words to the effect, "It would be paradoxical and absurd if 250,000 men were to invade Iraq and find very little." What was your response to that?
My response to that was to say, what you have to tell us is as to whether he's complying with the resolution. Is he giving immediate compliance and full compliance or not? And his answer to that was no, but you never know. It may be that if we're given more time, he will. It was really arising out of that conversation that I worked with him to try and get a fresh UN Security Council resolution. I mean, I kept working on that right up until the last moment.
As we know, but you, 4 days later, in fact, on the 24th of February, you tabled a draft resolution which stated that Iraq had failed to take the last opportunity to cooperate. But at that point, Dr. Blix was not saying to the United Nations, to the Security Council, that it is compared, say, with the position of Richard Butler in December 1998, who was absolutely clear that he was not getting the cooperation he sought from Saddam Hussein. The last report that Dr. Blix had given had been that he was getting, in principle, cooperation on process. That's what he was saying. Now, you may disagree with that and think it's not necessarily a proper interpretation of the evidence that you could see, but that's what he'd said. So that in a sense, you're having now to make the judgment to the Security Council on material breach at that time without the support of a statement by Hans Blix, that explicit support.
Well, whether he thought the action was justified or not, his reports were clear that the compliance was not immediate and the cooperation unconditional. It plainly wasn't. Indeed, actually, on his 7th of March document, where he was obviously moving further along the road, he says this at page 31. It is obvious that while the numerous initiatives which are now taken by the Iraqi side with a view to resolving some long-standing open disarmament issues can be seen as active or even proactive, these initiatives 3 to 4 months into the new resolution cannot be said to constitute immediate cooperation, nor do they necessarily cover all areas of relevance. They're nonetheless welcome. So what I felt was that we got to a situation where he was very much on the one hand and on the other, and here was the decision we had to take really at this point. And I think in the light of what the Iraq Survey Group have found, I actually think this judgment was right, which is why, personally, I don't believe if Hans Blix had another 6 months, it would have come out any differently. We had to really form this judgment. You know, if you've got a regime that you believe is a threat, in the end, you may change them through sanctions, but they have to be sustainable. You may change them by military force with all the problems there is. The simplest way of change is that there's a change of heart on the behalf of the regime. Now, we had to decide, did all this that he was doing with Blix really indicate to us? I mean, it was definitely in material breach of the UN resolution, but did it really indicate that this was someone who'd had a change of heart.